Hi, welcome to the second part of Factors that Threaten Biodiversity. This is part two. We're going to pick up right where we left off from the first video. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you enjoy. All right, let's look at disruption of habitat. So in the 1970s, off the Alaskan coast, they noticed a declining numbers of one keystone member of the food chain. And what I'm about to show you, I'm about to go into a diagram that you have in the textbook. You have this diagram in the textbook, and I'm going to show you how overfishing, okay, off the Alaskan coast affected other organisms along that Alaskan coast. Okay, so you can see how one keystone member, so a keystone member of a food chain, what that means is that the keystone part, what that means is that if you remove this organism from the food chain, from the food web, then you're essentially disrupting the whole process. Okay? So it's not like you can remove one organism and then it not have an effect on other organisms. A keystone member of a food web, if removed, can affect the entire food web as a whole and potentially cause a collapse. So let's dive into this so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is the image that you have in your textbook. Let's take a look at what happens here. So as fishermen were fishing for fish, they overfished and the population of fish declined dramatically. This in turn had an effect on the sea lions. So because the sea lions now had less fish to hunt for, their population numbers declined. And because their population numbers declined, that caused an effect on the orca whales. Now the orca whales' food supply has been reduced also. So their numbers were reduced, or they also moved to other more healthier fishing areas. And because this the orca whale numbers went down, sea otters essentially went uncontrolled. They were not, their population numbers were not being controlled by the orcas, so their population grew, and as their population grew, they ate sea urchins. Okay, sea urchins are those purple flower-looking organisms, but they're anything but. They're actually very spiny and hard. You can actually get those needles stuck in your hand or your feet if you accidentally step on them. So sea otters consume sea urchins. Now that sea urchins numbers are going down, see if we can get to that last one. Kelp forest grew uncontrollably because sea urchins controlled the number of kelp forest that grew. So as you can see, each organism affected the one on the food chain just previous to it. So because sea otter numbers went up, sea urchin numbers went down, causing an uncontrollable growth in kelp forest, and that was because the orca numbers went down, and that was because the sea lion numbers went down, and that originally was due to the fact that humans were overfishing in that area. So as you can see, the disruption to a habitat can cause a chain reaction in an entire food web and could potentially cause it to fail. All right, let's go back to our presentation. Okay, so one other thing I want to discuss as we move on. Let's talk about something called biological magnification. So what this means, an example of this is we're going to talk about mercury poisoning. Okay, the amount of mercury in a given body of water, because mercury that's dissolved in our hydrocarbons when we burn gases, when we burn oils, mercury gets caught in our atmosphere and then it comes and rains down into our bodies of water. So in a given body of water, you'll have 0.000003 parts per million. Okay, so for every million particles of water, you'll have 0.000003 particles of mercury. A very low number, not toxic at all, perfectly healthy. You can go swimming in this and it won't affect you at all. But what happens is that you have small organisms, oceanic producers, that end up absorbing this mercury. And in these oceanic organisms, these zooplankton that eat the producers, you actually find that they have a 0.04 parts per million of mercury. Compare that to how much is in the water. Zooplankton are actually at a level that is considered toxic for humans. Now, we don't really eat zooplankton, so that's not a big deal. But if we did eat zooplankton, we'd be eating organisms that have a high level, a toxic level, a level that would have an effect on the human body of mercury. So zooplankton, so you'll see biological magnification. You're going to notice that as we go up the food chain, our parts per million of mercury is going to dramatically increase. So what eats zooplankton but small fish? Now when we look at small fish and we observe their meat, okay, we notice that there's a 0.5 parts per million in small fish. So already, if we were to eat small fish, we're already eating a toxic level of mercury. Now, of course, the food chain doesn't stop there because small fish are eaten by larger fish like tuna. And when we look at tuna meat, they are 2 parts per million in large fish. So we are already at a very toxic level for humans in mercury just by eating tuna. And then what eats tuna but other larger predators? Like an eagle, for example, we find that they have 25 parts per million. Dolphins. Dolphins eat tuna. They have 2,000 parts per million of mercury. So these are essentially toxic waste vessels of mercury dolphins are. Now, luckily we don't eat dolphin, but this is an example of biological magnification. Biological magnification is just showing us how as you go up the food chain, okay, in particular with mercury, you'll notice that the parts per million in mercury as you go up the food chain dramatically increase as you go up the food chain. And that's biological magnification. So you really want to be careful when you're consuming animals. Now we eat at the level of the hawk, the eagle, and the dolphin. So we don't usually eat the hawk, we don't usually eat the dolphin. We usually eat the tuna and the large fish like that. So even with just the tuna, that 2 parts per million is still at a toxic level. Okay, let's talk about eutrophication. Eutrophication usually occurs because of our farming practices. We might use pesticides and fertilizers, which are really good for plants. Fertilizers have nitrogen, sulfur, potassium, and these molecules help plants grow healthy, right? We grow fruits and vegetables and so on. But sometimes what happens, as we put these particles into our food supply, there is what's called a runoff, and these fertilizers will run off into our bodies of water. And as they run into our bodies of water, organisms like algae will consume our fertilizers and they will just blossom. Okay? And then you'll have these lakes and ponds that will just be covered in this green algae. And what happens is that this algae will flourish because they have a lot of food now, right? That food is developed for plants, but with the runoff and it runs into our bodies of water, algae get a hold of it, they consume it, they grow, and what ends up happening, now algae uses oxygen also, just like other organisms do, like fish and crabs and so on. So as these algae blooms grow in our bodies of water, they essentially suffocate. They take up all the oxygen in the water and they suffocate any fish or organisms that live in that body of water. And you end up having dead organisms in these lakes and ponds and such. And that's eutrophication. So again, this is an example of how our human practices and what we do have an effect on the environment around us. And if we're not careful and if we're not managing these things properly, if we're not doing it responsibly, we are actually helping, and this is how actually we are helping in increasing our extinction rates on the planet. So that does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and good luck in your study.